You're listening to The Conversation. It's the 14th of April 2025 and Xi Jinping's plane touches down in Hanoi. The Chinese president shakes hands on the tarmac with his Vietnamese counterpart, Long Gong. It's just 2 weeks since Donald Trump stood in front of the White House with that now notorious chart. Almost every country in the world was slapped with enormous tariffs on US imports. Trump called it Liberation Day. Xi Jinping is in Vietnam on the first leg of a charm offensive around Southeast Asia, including stops in Malaysia and Cambodia. His message is clear. We are your neighbours, and we're still here to do business. But this visit isn't just a knee-jerk reaction to Trump's new tariff war. China has known for decades that it needs to stop relying so much on exports to the West, and its plan has paid off. Now, after Trump's Liberation Day tariffs were struck down by the US Supreme Court, the US president is preparing to visit Beijing in mid-May for a summit of his own with Xi. And China is in a strong position to negotiate. I'm Gemma Ware from The Conversation, a news and analysis platform partnering journalists with academics. Welcome to The Conversation Weekly, where experts explain how we ended up here. In this episode, how China's ability to weather Trump's tariff war was 20 years in the making.
Zhao Wang, you're an assistant professor of economics at the University of Sussex in the UK, where you research China's economic policy. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Gemma.
So, Zhao, what with the Iran war and the economic shocks that it's causing around the world, it feels like a long time ago since the US Supreme Court decided back in February to overturn Trump's Liberation Day tariffs.
The Supreme Court ruling that President Trump's use of these emergency tariffs that he has implemented are illegal.
The Supreme Court's ruling on tariffs is deeply disappointing.
Trump immediately reacted by slapping a 10% universal tariff on all exports for 150 days, so until the 24th of July. How does all this affect China, though? What's it done to its tariff rate?
Before the Supreme Court's ruling, the effective tariff rate on China was 47%. Now we are at 19 to 24%. The other kind of tariff, such as steels, coppers, aluminum, about 50% of the tariff rate remained, which are not affected by this ruling.
Is it a winner of the situation?
I think that's a question to every nation, not just to China, because this Supreme Court's ruling, it is a success to U.S. Constitution for sure. But in practice, it has imposed more work, more uncertainty to a lot of the bilateral negotiation between the U.S. and then other nations. So when the world trade system is facing such uncertainty, such disruption, I don't think anyone can be the winner.
What you're saying then is that a drop from 47% tariffs might on face value seem great, but it's really unclear as to what's going to happen. And so you can't plan for it.
I think business by now, they probably have plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D. So several different plans, and then they have to really prepare for all those different scenarios. At the same time, just try to minimize the risk as much as possible along the way. And some of the business might still be wait and see, want to have a little bit clearer picture of what the future might be. That, again, puts a drag on growth everywhere. So when business do not operate, do not invest, that's where everybody suffers. The old time of the free trade really has gone.
What else has been going on between the US and China in terms of trade in the past few months since the US Supreme Court ruling?
Trump also announced a new investigation investigating the so-called excess capacity in manufacturing sector against 16 countries, including China and Vietnam. Also, he initiated a new investigation into the foreign partners' so-called forced labor legislation. And at the same time, China also launched 2 new investigations. China has been investigating the U.S. policy in restricting Chinese export to the U.S. as well as U.S. export of advanced technologies. And then the second investigation focused on specifically of China's green technology export, which is one of the key high value added export now.
This tit for tat, it's quite a common pattern in the recent trade tensions between China and the US. But the bottom line here is that China's actually managed to weather this latest round of Trump's trade war pretty well. And the reasons for that go back quite a long way. So where do we start?
Then we will have to start from the very beginning with this historical moment when China got admitted into the World Trade System, the WTO, in 2001.
To adopt the draft decision on the accession of the People's Republic of China.
Before China entered the WTO, China was only a very small part of the global trade system. In 2001, China was only trading about $266 billion with the rest of the world, which was only 4% of the global trade share. So that was a very small number. But 10 years later, in 2010, China was already trading $1.58 trillion, accounting about 10% of the global trade volume. The total trade volume increased sixfold in that 10 years. And then 1 year before that, in 2009, China surpassed Germany as the world's largest exporter. So that was the time that China was really the world's factory, producing a lot of cheap consumer goods flooded to the world economy. But China realized that they need to diversify. They need to make it more resilient to the rest of the world. One important thing was the global financial crisis.
The closing bell at the New York Stock Exchange, the main index, down over 7%. Shock and panic evident on the faces of those on the trading floor.
Initially, China was trading with the rest of the world, mainly to the US, to Europe. But the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009 made the Chinese government realize the external environment was not as tranquil and reliable as they thought it was. So such a big financial shock can really have a huge impact on domestic economy. That's where actually this kind of a diversification and redistribution started to emerge in Beijing.
Tell me more about this domestic consumption issue and how the Chinese government decided to try and tackle that by diversifying.
So when you look at the picture of the trade, it was a magnificent increase. A very small player become a big player. There was a saying that whatever China buys is become more expensive. Whatever China sells becomes cheaper. But on the other side of the spectrum was the consumption story. In 2001, the consumption share in GDP was about 45%. It's a little bit low, but that's okay.
So people in China buying goods and services.
Yes, and this is the household, not including the government. But 10 years later, in 2011, consumption as a share of GDP has dropped significantly to about 34-35%. So on the one hand, China became the world's factory, exporting, investment. That's all very booming, very encouraging. But the consumers in China were not benefiting as much as those export corporate or the states. So really, they were suffering or compensating for this high growth of the Chinese story. So that's where, when you look at the domestic market, it was quite weak. And then taking into account what we just said about the global financial crisis, government suddenly realized now if the export market becomes somewhat in a turmoil, all those industrial output will go nowhere because we don't have a domestic market to absorb it. Chinese government in 2008 quickly announced this 4 trillion fiscal stimulus package, which was at the time very timely in order to calm the market, in order to support the economic growth. But the side effect from this 4 trillion stimulus package was also severe. One, it led to a huge property market bubble. Two, it led to a significant, massive infrastructure boom, which at the time was good, but, on balance, it was overinvestment, over-borrowed. So over the years, by around 2011, 2012, people start to worry about the property market bubble, as well as the sustainability of the local government debt. So that's where really the wheel has really turned in terms of transforming the economy into something more resilient. And that's where the Belt and the Road Initiative really started to be rolling out.
It all began in 2013 during a state visit to Kazakhstan. President Xi Jinping mentioned the need to establish a massive infrastructure development network designed to reroute global trade.
This Belt and Road Initiative was taking a very historical route, which called the Silk Road, and that involves a lot of infrastructure investment in developing countries and in global south. At that time, people interpreted that as China exporting the overcapacity. But this kind of exporting overcapacity is also strengthening the trade with non-US, non-EU partners, right? So they are developing a lot of investments with local governments in Africa, in Latin American countries. That's already part of the diversification. And then fast forward to 2018, when the trade war started, a lot of the infrastructure or a lot of the roadmap was already rolled out. So people realized, okay, we have already established a good business relationship with African nations, with governments, with Latin American partners. The first trade war actually accelerated the trade diversification.
So they'd essentially adopted what I think is called a dual circulation strategy, hadn't they? Where they were focusing both on trying to shore up their domestic demand, but also find these external partners. And actually by doing that, without really knowing that this trade war would happen, they prepared for it.
Exactly. So the dual circulation strategy was formally proposed in 2020, but a lot of the work actually already began. The aim of the dual circulation strategy is to build a more or less complete domestic circulation in terms of demand and supply. And then it would aid by external circulation, which would be a trade with the rest of the world.
In particular with China, we're going to be doing a Section 301 trade action.
When Trump's first trade war had begun in March 2018, how reliant was China on its trade with the US?
At that time, US was still one of the biggest trading partner with China, but China was already diversifying a lot, actually. There was already a discussion about the decoupling from the US to the Chinese system, but only when we look at it from now, we can see the trajectory more clearly.
So when the first Trump administration arrived and this trade war began in 2018, we know that what's been called a great reallocation began. Can you explain what that was and what it meant?
A lot of the multinational companies, especially those involved in business with China as well as the US, they are pulling out factories and then production units from China into neighboring countries, such as Vietnam and sometimes Mexico, so that they can take advantage of not being imposed the tariff, but still having this kind of a supply chain smoothly conducted. And then you can see from the data that the direct trade between China and the US declined during the trade war, but the trade between US and the third party, mainly in Vietnam or Mexico or India, increased simultaneously. So in fact, it's not really a decline in the trade between US and China. They are just paying a middleman to do a lot of the trading.
So this great reallocation, was that a top-down decision by the Chinese government to do that, or was it businesses making those decisions on their own? Was this planned, or was it organic?
Actually, I think a lot of those great reallocations or the decisions are on the ground implemented by business themselves because they are operating every day. They need to make sure that their business decisions take into account all those uncertainty. So that's where they start to try to find ways to mitigate those trade tariff impact. The companies that have the best position to relocate are the multinational ones, right? Because they have a global network, they have the capacity to actually relocate. So that's where we see in the data as well. Multinationals start to reallocate into neighboring countries and then to make sure their supply chain complete eventually. So for the domestic businesses or the small businesses that cannot do those kind of rerouting, they will just pull out the market directly. And then they will try to explore other markets altogether. But of course, policymakers do observe those kind of organic response as well. So to them, this is also part of their kind of a confidence that they can really start a fight back about this trade war. The first trade war definitely had an initial negative impact on the Chinese economy, but gradually business was adjusting. There were more policy stimulus package put out as well. So in the end, before the pandemic, the impact of the trade war was more or less minimized.
So in January 2020, China reached a trade deal with the US to end this trade war. And as part of that, China agreed to buy an additional $200 billion worth of American products. What was the reaction in China to that moment?
There was a gradual acceptance from the Chinese side that, okay, we will respond, but we will be also behaving rationally, trying to reach something that's mutually benefiting to each other. The fact that they reached a trade deal, which was more or less in favor of the US trade policy, was kind of a compromise from China. Along the way, China has been facing a lot of the criticisms and the competition from not just US, but also Europe, because China was the world factory for many years, and then now they were moving up the supply chain, becoming not just a supplier, but also a competitor. So I think in general, domestically, it was accepted that this is something that China has to make a compromise of in order to continue to be part of this world trade system.
By 2025, how well prepared do you think China was for a second Trump administration and the prospect of another really significant trade war?
So the Financial Times had published a very interesting figure showing different regions, their share in China's exports. So there's US, Europe, ASEAN countries, Latin America, and then Africa. It's very clear that from 2018, the share of the US has dropped significantly. So I think that's part of the result of the trade diversification. Biden administration did not cancel a lot of the tariffs, so the tariffs were still there. So basically, businesses was already taking the tariff as given and start to realign their business profile and their trade network. So by the time we go to April 2025, a lot of the firms were already readjusted. So I think the only shocking thing was how sweeping and how damaging the second trade war to every country, not just to China.
Coming up, China's direct trade with the US collapses. So how does it end up with its biggest trade surplus ever? That's after this short break. So in April 2025, on what Trump called Liberation Day, a renewed tariff war broke out between China and the US.
In a few moments, I will sign a historic executive order instituting reciprocal tariffs on countries throughout the world.
President Trump's sweeping global tariffs for more than 90 countries have come into effect.
What did China do in response to try and protect its export markets?
I still remember when I first heard the news, how shocked I was and then how unbelievable this policy announcement was. And not to mention how hard to comprehend the calculation of the tariff rate. So compared to the first trade war, there are a few things that quite stand out from my perspective. The first is still we observe the tit for tat strategy. Trump put in 34%, China put in 34%. Trump put in 145, but China put in 125 and then said, we are not playing along the game anymore. But just by observing the statements or rhetoric of Chinese authorities, this time around, it appears to be more strong-willed. They even call the US as unilaterally bullying everybody else. The Ministry of Commerce also said, we will fight towards the end. After the first announcement about the 34% tariff on Chinese imports, President Xi Jinping went to Southeast Asia.
Xi Jinping on a diplomatic trade push in Southeast Asia in the face of Trump's aggressive levies. In his first stop, Vietnam.
He visited Vietnam, visited Malaysia, and visited Cambodia. They want to build a regional alliance to fight back together collectively toward this trade war. So this was not obviously observed in the first trade war. China fought back a little bit more strongly in this trade war as well, not just targeting the agricultural sector, automobile, but also they took control of the export of the rare earth minerals. Those are really important ingredients for electrical vehicles, semiconductors, as well as military devices.
Particularly concerning to the U.S., China is set to ban the selling of these supplies to 16 U.S. companies. All but one are in the defense and aerospace industries.
So it's very uplifting for domestic Chinese observers. A lot of people on the internet would root for such a kind of escalation. But I think at the same time, it also sent out a message internationally saying we are not backing down. And so far, still, we haven't observed any concrete trade deal or any consensus from both sides as well. There was a negotiation.
President Trump has described his meeting with China's President Xi Jinping as amazing, saying that they made a series of outstanding decisions to avert a spiraling trade war.
But so far, we haven't reached any really concrete decision from that.
You mentioned before about this great reallocation that happened after the first trade war. But the impact of the second Trump administration's tariffs is global. It doesn't really spare anybody. So countries like Vietnam are also being targeted in the same way as countries like China. How does that affect this third-party routing that China was benefiting from after that first trade war?
So I think that's also took a lot of people by surprise that Trump was actually making tariff to everybody. But you can see different countries have different responding strategies. Countries such as in the third-party rerouting kind of a group, such as Vietnam, they moved very quickly trying to reach trade deals with the U.S. because they know strategically they were in a critical position to be in this global relocation.
The president announcing we've struck a trade deal with Vietnam that includes a 20% tariff on their imports to the U.S.
Because this is such a comprehensive kind of a attack to every country with different degrees, China is just trying to do the best that they can by relying less on US directly, diverse a little bit more towards other economies. And I think in the end, we can see from 2025, China achieved somewhat good outcome in the end, because despite this trade war, China reached a record high trade surplus in 2025, reaching $1.2 trillion.
How is that possible? Because China's direct exports to the US plummeted by 20% in 2025. Imports into China from the US fell by 14.6%. Yeah, China had a record trade surplus. So how did that happen?
Yes, as you said, the direct trade between US and China dropped a lot during 2025. But if you look at other groups, we observe huge increase in China's export to other regions. For example, China's export to Africa grew by 26% in 2025, to ASEAN by 13%, to EU by 8%, and to the Latin American regions grew by 7%. So as you can see, the direct trade between US and China was falling, but it was more than compensated by the increase in trade to other parts of the world. We already observed this great reallocation in the first trade war, and then in the second trade war, the conclusion becomes even more prominent. And taking a little bit longer perspective, this is not an isolated example, 2025. The export actually was growing steadily in the past few years. It was just because of the trade war, because it's headline. So when China, the trade surplus actually reached the record high, it becomes a surprise.
So what does China's record trade surplus actually mean? Because some people in the West are suggesting it could flood the global market with high-end manufacturing, such as electric cars and solar panels. This has been dubbed the China 2.0 shock. How important will that be in the future?
I think it might fundamentally change the landscape of the global economy in the next few decades. And when you compare this China Shock 2 to China Shock 1, it is more alarming now than before. This is because the nature of the shock has changed. In China Shock 1, the excess supply of the goods are mainly in the lower end of value-added chain. It's mainly just day-to-day use like toys, textile, or even small appliance. But now fast forward to today with China Shock 2, what China has been exporting is no longer just toys and then buttons and then textile anymore. It is electrical cars, it is batteries, it is even robots and even solar panels. So those are the high value added, high technology products, which directly threaten the survival of a lot of the high-tech firms in advanced economies such as in US and in Europe. I do think people should take this shock more seriously.
At the same time as all this has been going on, China has in recent months been playing host to a number of world leaders who are looking to renew their trade ties with the country.
German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has arrived in China.
Keir Starmer says he wants a more consistent approach to China.
President Emmanuel Macron then, they're heading to China, due to land very shortly, in fact, for a 3-day state visit, focusing mainly on trade and diplomatic talks.
How does that fit into China's more strategic approach to this second trade war?
Beijing has a very busy month hosting all those world leaders. I read this phenomenon as a rethinking from many countries about their future in this highly uncertain world. It's not just China that has been seeking allies, try to diversify risks, but it is also the same train of thought from many nations. That's why for a lot of the past US allies, they are rethinking about their relationship with the US, about their relationship with China, how and where they position themselves in the future. Keeping their doors open now become crucial to every nation. And China has been sending out a lot of friendly kind of a policy as well. So I would say that's where China wants to seek more security, more partnership, as well as what other nations also want to diversify and explore their options.
And next, it's Trump's turn. He's planning to visit Beijing in mid-May for a much-vaunted summit with Xi Jinping. What do you think China's hoping to get out of that meeting?
What China wants is some predictability and some sustainability in terms of, if you want to operate in this way, can you give me some bottom line, right? Can you give me some operation, kind of a manual or operation disciplines so that we can incorporate that in our decision making? The worst case that you want is that just complete chaos. Then nobody knows how to prepare for it. So I think this would be what Beijing wants, at least from Trump. But for President Trump, he probably wants a really flashy news headline, a good picture in the People's Hall or the Forbidden City or any significant place. And then to him, the fact that he has this dialogue with the leader of the second largest economy in the world would be a good diplomatic success to him.
Thank you so much, Zhao. It's been fascinating hearing what's been happening from you, so we appreciate you coming on. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
That's it for this week's episode of The Conversation Weekly. You can read more analysis by academic experts about Trump's tariffs and the recent Supreme Court decision on The Conversation. We'll put some links to further reading in our show notes. This episode was written and produced by Mend Mariwani and me, Gemma Ware, and I'm also the show's executive producer. Sound mixing is by Eleanor Brezzi, and our theme music is by Nita Saul. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. You can also sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts with a wider audience. If you like what we do, please consider supporting us at donate.theconversation.com. That's donate.theconversation.com. And please do also rate and review the podcast wherever you follow us. Thanks for listening.